In the Russia-Ukraine war, sending ammunition and soldiers to the conflict zones via bridges and railways is an inevitable need for both armies because the loss of supply lines brings failure in the war. Since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Ukrainian army has successfully destroyed many railroads and bridges used by the Russian invaders as supply lines, unable to deliver troops and ammunition to the conflict zones. The Russian army was forced to retreat from many regions. The inability of the Russian army to make shipments to the conflict areas was frequently brought to the fore by the statements made by the Russian soldiers during the winter months. The statements of the soldiers revealed the magnitude of the troubles they were experiencing. Russian soldiers were freezing to death at the front because they could not even get their winter clothes. In addition, the lack of ammunition resulted in the Russian invaders not responding to the attacks of the Ukrainian army. The first important supply line lost by the Russian invaders was the Kerch Bridge. The construction of this bridge begun in 2015 on the orders of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. This date was very significant. The Russian army invaded Crimea in 2014, immediately after the invasion. Construction of the Kerch Bridge connecting Russia to Crimea begun. This was Putin's preparation for the invasion of Ukraine, which he launched in February 2022. Putin was going to send troops and weapons from Russia to Crimea and from there expanding to Ukrainian territory. But at an unexpected attack, the Kerch Bridge was destroyed shortly after the start of the invasion of Ukraine. There have been many interpretations of the destruction of the Kerch Bridge. Russia claimed that the bridge was blown up by a car bomb. Another claim was that the explosion was the result of a drone attack. Another claim was that the explosion was caused by a boat passing under the bridge during the explosion. Many other allegations came to the fore, but it is not clear how the bridge was blown up. The only known fact was that the Russian army lost a very important bridge. Since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Barum has undoubtedly seen the most fighting. The Russian army also lost its supply bridges in Barum. The Ukrainian army has inflicted great losses on the invaders with its attacks in recent months. These losses included supply lines. The UK Ministry of Defence made the following statement about the bridges lost by the Russian invaders in Barum in the city center. The Bakhmut River now defines the front line. Ukrainian forces hold the west of the city and have destroyed key bridges over the river, which runs from north to the south along a 800 meters wide strip of an open space, with Ukrainian troops firing from fortified buildings to the west. This area has become a killing zone and is likely to make it extremely difficult for Wagner's forces to try to continue their frontal assaults to the west. One of the bridges that the Ukrainian army occupied in Barum was a bridge connecting Barum and the city of Kostiantynivka. The plan of the Russian army was to occupy Bakhmut, cross over this bridge to Kostiantynivka and expand into Ukrainian territory. But as a result of the Ukrainian army's offensive, the bridge collapsed along with the Russian army's plan. Kharkovka Bridge is another important bridge through which the Russian invaders transported troops and ammunition. This bridge over the Novokharkovka Dam is located in the Kherson region. This bridge, which was frequently used by the Russian invaders, was destroyed as a result of an attack by the Ukrainian army. A Ukrainian official made the following statement after the operation targeting the Kharkovka Bridge. They will try to repair the destroyed bridge, look for an alternative crossing. But they are running out of time and money. As soon as they built a new bridge, we will destroy it again. Knowing the value of supply lines in warfare, the Ukrainian army has targeted bridges, one of the most important supply lines of the Russian invaders since the beginning of the war. One of these bridges was the bridge of the Molokna River. The Russian invaders used this bridge as the main supply line to cover the deficiencies at the front. Also, an important feature of this bridge was to connect the city of Melitopol with a village in Zaporizhia. Ivan Fedorov, the mayor of Melitopol, made a statement about the bridge, which was blown up when the Russian army attacked it with HIMARS missiles. Fedorov sarcastically said that the bridge was tired, adding the Ukrainian armed forces are always nearby. you will run away without looking back. The Ukrainian army destroyed railroads as well as bridges used by the Russian occupiers as supply lines. One of the destroyed supply lines was the railroad in Sanko, Crimea. Moreover, the timing of the destruction of this bridge was very significant. The timing of the Ukrainian army caused more casualties to the Russian occupiers because the railroad was blown up while the Russian invaders were transporting caliber cruise missiles over this railway. The Russian army, which already has an increasing ammunition problem every day, lost many important ammunition, especially caliber missiles, as a result of this attack. The loss of the supply lines used by the Russian occupiers for the transportation of troops and ammunition means that their problems on the front line are increasing in the face of the spring operation in which the Ukrainian army is preparing for a counterattack. And Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov said the attack may start at any moment. It seems that the Russian invaders will have a big problem because they have lost their supply lines. The Ukrainian army has been preparing for a counterattack for a long time. It seems that the course of the war will change after this attack, which aims to completely remove the Russian invaders from Ukrainian territory in the face of the increasing losses of the Russian army. The Ukrainian army continues to strengthen with the support of Western and European countries. Western and European countries provided military aid to the Ukrainian army for the counterattack called the Spring Attack. These acts will cause the attack to be even stronger. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has tried many ways to compensate for the losses he suffered at the front, but without success. The Russian people do not support Putin's inhuman practices. For this reason, Russian youth do not want to take part in the occupation of Ukraine. The Russian army, which has lost approximately 200,000 soldiers since the beginning of the war, is also having trouble finding soldiers. In addition to the problem of military personnel and ammunition, the destruction of supply lines seems to bring Russia to its end. Unlike Russia, the Ukrainian army continues to grow stronger every day. Ukrainian leader Zelensky is making history against the Russian invaders with his people and army who believe in victory, while Putin is struggling with a series of problems that he never thought of when he started the occupation of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has repelled Russian invaders from many occupied territories. Many of the soldiers in the occupied territories are waiting for the right moment to surrender to Ukrainian troops. The Ukrainian army is using a number of practices to integrate Russian soldiers who want to surrender into the army or free them. Thanks to the I Want to Live project, tens of thousands of Russians surrendered to the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers who surrendered continue to explain the problems they experienced in the Russian army. These statements not only show the ruthlessness of the occupiers, but also prove that they are exhausted. Could the loss of bridges and railroads used as supply lines spell the end of the Russian army? What will Russia do in the face of a Ukrainian counterattack? Will the course of the war change after this attack? We are in a period when Russian losses increased the most throughout the war. The difficult conditions in the Russian positions are increasing every day. Soldiers in the Russian forces are devastated while trying to focus on the war. However, they are not successful at all in this regard, and they cannot be successful in either attack or defense organizations. All Russian soldiers think about is getting out of this war. Russian soldiers do not have many options to survive the war. So what do Russian soldiers have to do to save their lives? And who will save them? Ukraine extended its hand to the Russian soldiers on this issue many times, and these attempts by Kiev began to yield results. The Russians, ready to surrender, show great interest in the I Want to Live project as a result of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's calls for Russian soldiers to surrender. A total of 9,836 soldiers applied from the barracks in the Russian Federation or from the temporarily occupied areas of Ukraine. So with what methods are thousands of soldiers surrendering to the Ukrainian army? What are the Russians doing to avoid being caught by their commander? Let's solve this puzzle together. The surrender process of Russian soldiers was also very risky for the Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian authorities who developed the project followed an innovative way to find a solution to this risk. Ukrainian forces received the greatest support from UAVs throughout the war in both offensive and reconnaissance missions. UAVs, under the control of Ukrainian forces, have accomplished great things. Now a new one has been added to the Unmanned Aerial Vehicle Task Pool. The Ukrainian military has launched a program to use drones in an unexpected role. This program is part of the I Want to Live project. A Russian soldier throws his gun to the ground, raises his hands, and nervously follows a path marked by a drone that will lead him to the 54th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army. After the start of the surrender program to drones, the Ukrainian General Staff released a training video explaining how Russian soldiers can surrender to Ukrainian drone. The project is part of Ukraine's far-reaching effort to persuade Russian soldiers to give up the project. I Want to Live includes a hotline, a website, and a social communication channel dedicated to communicating with Russian soldiers and their families. It is not fully foreseen how much unmanned aerial vehicles will support this meaningful project. It is too early to say anything definitive on this issue. Without drones, Ukrainian soldiers would meet the Russians who wanted to surrender. Since this process will take place at a point close to the front, Ukrainian soldiers will be at great risk. Thanks to drones, this risk has disappeared. The surrender process is progressing very well. However, there was a big question mark in the minds of the Russian soldiers who were mobilized and did not want to fight, according to a decree signed by Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Those who are against war and do not want to fight will be sentenced to up to 15 years in prison. This decree frightened many Russian soldiers. Also, the soldiers were concerned about their families who were in Russia on this issue. The Ukrainian authorities reassured the Russian soldiers. The Ukrainians stated that they would not explain how the surrendered Russian soldiers surrendered. All surrendered Russian soldiers will be recorded as captured on the battlefield. In addition, the Kiev government has made many commitments to the Russian soldiers who will surrender the coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war, assured that the Russian soldiers would be treated in accordance with the terms of the Geneva Agreement surrendered. Russian soldiers will be able to receive assistance and legal support from other international organizations, monitoring the conditions of stay of prisoners of war by the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Russian soldiers sent to Ukraine as part of the mobilization cannot meet even their basic needs. You may recall that some Russian soldiers in Ukraine mentioned that they have the right to eat only one meal a day. At the same time, Russian soldiers are not allowed to meet with their families. Because of this, many rebellions occurred. The Kiev government provides the surrendering Russian soldiers with 3 meals a day, medical care, and regular contact with relatives. The situation of the Russians staying in the Ukrainian camps is shared with the public in a transparent manner. Some media outlets were allowed to visit the camps. In addition, the International Committee of the Red Cross organizes routine visits to the Russian soldiers who manage to survive despite the difficult conditions in Ukraine, surrender, and begin to live in humanitarian conditions after their surrender. The Russian soldiers have 2 options. The first of these is to voluntarily exchange with military personnel of the Ukrainian armed forces in captivity in the Russian Federation and return to Russia. The other is the opportunity to apply for asylum in Ukraine or other European countries. The choice is left entirely to the Russian soldiers. By the way, it's worth mentioning, he also gave e-cards containing information on how to surrender to the Russian soldiers released as part of the Ukrainians' exchange of prisoners of war. In this way, the Russian soldiers who have to return to the war know how to surrender themselves again. About the soldiers who return to Russia after the surrender, the Kremlin government will not know anything about how they were captured. Even if it is difficult, they can continue with their lives. But with an asylum application, they can have a perfect life from scratch. The Ukrainian authorities have mobilized all the means at their disposal for the success of this campaign. Both high-tech and low-tech communication tools were used in Ukraine's announcement of this project to the Russians. Artillery units routinely used multiple rocket launch systems to fire shells, each filled with 1,500 leaflets at Russian positions. At the same time as SMS messages were sent to Russian phones telling them to lay down their weapons. So what kind of path did Ukraine follow to develop this project? The Russian Federal Service for Communications, Information Technology and Mass Media Supervision is the body that carries out all censorship within Russia. It's abbreviated as Roskomnadzor. The project went into effect 6 months ago. The Ukrainian president made many calls and introduced the project to the Russian people from the moment the project came into effect. Roskomnadzor regularly tries to block access to it. Despite all the efforts by Roskomnadzor, more than 14 million people from the territory of Russia visited the I Want to Live project website. Applications are not only made by Russian soldiers. At the same time, the relatives and loved ones of the soldiers who were drafted into the army can apply for them. This is because the mobilized Russians did not have access to the internet or mobile communications when they arrived in Ukraine. I Want to Live. Zeit is a government project designed to help Russian military personnel surrender safely. The project receives more than 100 calls every day. In the project, with great demand, the Ukrainian authorities even added a chatbot to its website to meet this demand. However, the demand is increasing every day. The biggest factor in the increasing interest in the project is the increasing casualties of the Russian forces. Recently, over the past 2 months, Russian forces have lost as much as a third of the number of soldiers they lost. Russia has recruited many Russian citizens without military experience. The mobilized Russian citizens were deployed to the front in Ukraine without adequate training. The increase in the number of casualties frightened these soldiers and prompted them to seek a solution that could save their lives. Ukrainian Defense Ministry Defense Intelligence spokesman Andriy Yusov stated in December that 1,200,000 applications were received for the project. These calls were not a demand for surrender, but the families of the mobilized soldiers learned how they could save the lives of their loved ones. Looking at the current demand, we can clearly see how the mobilized Russian soldiers are affected by the increase in casualties. The fact that Russian soldiers want to live and not participate in war campaigns has a really nice effect. The Ukrainian government is making great efforts to keep the Russians who were forcibly sent to this brutal war alive. If the number of surrendered Russian soldiers goes at this rate, the Russian positions may be emptied in a short time. This will not please the Kremlin. Russian forces rapidly shifted their focus from the city to the flanks and once again increased the pressure on the Ukrainian defense that was protecting the home of a supply road. Ukrainian defense gave in to the pressure. Russians achieved their goal and assumed control over a trench in front of the road. However, there is one caveat. Last time I told you that Russians realized that they were lured into disadvantageous fighting around the train station, changed their tactic and managed to push Ukrainians to the western side of the railways. I also told you that in the aftermath of massive attacks and counterattacks in the northern part of Barum, both Ukrainian and Russian artillery leveled the residential area to the ground, which forced the Ukrainians to step back. The freshest report suggests that the main Ukrainian defense line goes along Kranius Street. A Ukrainian fighter reported that the residential area south of Rose Alley was left by Ukrainians. The commanders of the units on the ground evaluated the condition of the infrastructure and decided that it was physically no longer fit for defense. So in order to avoid unnecessary losses, the order was given to withdraw to more reliable positions. However, despite the fact that the defense line moved back, attacking it became more difficult. According to Russian sources, Russians are maintaining a permanent presence only in the outer quarter of the region, as all buildings in between have been destroyed. This means that in order to maintain constant pressure, they have to make a long hike through the gray zones, which increases their losses due to snipers, mortar and artillery strikes. As can be seen from the combat footage, The streets in front of Ukrainian positions are filled with Russian corpses. In the southern part of the region, a fighter from the Ukrainian 1st Border Detachment reported that Russians made 3 attempts to move closer to the high-rise buildings. Unfortunately for Russians, they are attacking from tactically disadvantageous positions, as Ukrainians are not only located in higher buildings but also on a hill. As a result, the Russians failed to develop a bridgehead north of Krasinski Street and lost 25 troops. In the meantime, the Ukrainian artillery crews continued to hunt down forces concentrations south of Kherson's Carver Street. Today's combat footage showed that the 3rd Assault Brigade eliminated at least 6 houses that were seen to receive ammunition or housed Russian troops. But the biggest news by far is that Russians managed to breach one of the most important lines of fortifications in front of the Kremova Highway and cut off supplies to Ukrainian fighters in Bakhmut. Yesterday, Russian sources reported that the main axis of advance was changed and it was once again decided to focus on cutting off the supply roads. As you remember, the closest Russian positions were near the rails and most of the fights took place in the tree line that separated the Ukrainian-held field and the Russian-held field. Recently, Russians launched a comprehensive attack and managed to push Ukrainians out of the long trench that leads right to the Kremova Highway, which means that they have essentially established physical control over the road. The advisor to the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Yan Gagin, stated that Barum was finally taken into a pocket and Ukrainian forces have no ability to provide supplies or retreat. However, if we look at the satellite imagery, we can see that Ukrainians developed an extensive trench network in front of the road, behind the road, and also all over the place. This was done precisely for such a development to ensure that Russians would not be able to control the whole region by just breaching the fence in one trench. Russians opened 3 lines of attack in order to not allow the Ukrainian defense to work synergistically. As a result, 2 attacks were repelled and 1 Russian attack succeeded and they established control over the western line. This put Russians in a very inconvenient position as they are surrounded by Ukrainians. Geolocated footage showed that Ukrainians were using grenade throwers firing at Russians from 3 sides. A Ukrainian fighter from the Adar battalion reported that the situation is under control and for the most part, Russians are being eliminated and taken captive in the face of the overwhelming evidence that the claims of the encirclement of Barum are false. Russian officials faced a huge backlash and pressure. The head of the Wagner forces also criticized the DPR authorities for undermining public trust. Shortly, the head of the DPR made an official follow-up appeal and withdrew the statement about the encirclement of Bakhmut. Overall, Ukrainians have built a very powerful defense line in front of the home of a highway that ensures that Russians cannot establish control over the region by breaching just one strongpoint. Decentralization of defense allowed Ukrainians to immobilize Russian attackers and prevent them from achieving tactical goals. Careful planning ensures that Ukrainian fighters will continue receiving supplies via other small roads because even the Russians got close. They are located behind the hill and have no visual control over the ground south of the highway.